So, good night for all students of the Federal University. Thank you so much to come here one more again. We are in the schedule of several conferences, and now today we have Tom Ginsburg, and I will introduce before Professor Claudia Lima Marx, our Dean of the University, to present and to start the event. And thank you so much, Professor Claudia Lima Marx, to come here and to present us and to open this conference today. So I will pass the word for Claudia Lima Marx.
Thank you very much, Professor Carlos Reverbel. It's indeed a great honor to be here to introduce this important event. We indeed is a pleasure to receive Professor Tom Ginsburg from the Chicago Law School in our law school in Porto Alegre, Brazil. Professor Tom Ginsburg is a very well-known jurist in the world, professor of international law with important work at the Hague Tribunal, especially the Iran and U.S. claims tribunal. And he's also a very interesting and inspired thinker about political science. And tonight he will speak about how to save a constitutional democracy, a very important subject for Brazil, and I believe for the entire world in this very difficult and complex time that we are living now. So in name of the faculty and our students, I want to thank you, your time, your patience, and your openness to speak to us in Brazil. We really appreciate that, and we are sure that will be very inspiring for our students and for our colleagues. So I want to thank also Professor Carlos Reverbel for this initiative, and also Dr. Romulo George Jr. and the LLM student Melanie Chevik for this preparation. So I'm really thrilled to hear you tonight. So thank you very much to be here.
Thank you very much, Dean, and thank you, Professor Romulo, Professor Carlos. Thank you both for inviting me. I wish I could be there in person. That would be great, but this is the next best thing. And I always like traveling to Brazil, even virtually, because, you know, the countries, United States and Brazil, have certain common problems and experience. And particularly my topic today, the challenge of constitutional democracy, is one which we are both facing very severely, the challenge of populism and misgovernment under some circumstances, and how one builds institutions under such circumstances. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint here. Let's hope this works. And there we go. I think you can see. And so this is, the topic is one that is of my last book, and you see the cover there, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, which is a book I wrote with Professor Aziz Haq, who is one of my colleagues. But it's also the topic of my next book, which is coming out in about a month or two, which is on international law and democracy. So when we think about what we can do to make sure that constitutional democracy is strong, obviously, one set of answers is local. It's about domestic constitutional institutions and politics. But in our globalized world, I also think international law has some role to play. So I'll primarily talk about this book. And the thing we start with in the book is this question: what is constitutional democracy? You know, and is it actually worth saving? And there's a large literature on this question of, what is democracy? And I'm not an expert in it. But for us, we have a very, a three-part definition, and it's a kind of thin definition. By thin, I mean it doesn't have many components beyond elections, but it has some. For some people, democracy is only elections. And that's one common approach in political science. And in our definition, you do need elections. For us, we ask whether the modal adult, that means the middle person in the society, can vote. And that means actually that no country was really a democracy until the early 20th century, because women are the majority in every society, or most, and they weren't given the vote even in, now established democracies till then. So, elections in which everyone can vote, more or less, with the modal adult, and the loser turns over power voluntarily. That's the very basic definition. But what we observe, of course, is that one cannot have those elections. They cannot be effective without certain legal components. And this is why it's important to bring in legal freedoms and rights. Obviously, you can't have a free election if you don't have free speech to criticize the government, freedom of association to organize, and a right to vote. So there's certain core rights which are included. But we don't go so far as to say that every human right must be in a definition of democracy. Also, we say that democracy requires the rule of law in the following sense. You can't really have an election unless you have someone counting the votes in a neutral way. And that requires a certain kind of bureaucratic rule of law, which is essential. And usually when we discuss bureaucracy, most of the time that's an insult. We say, oh, you're acting bureaucratically. But actually, bureaucracy is good for democracy because it means that you have people who will follow the rules no matter who's in charge. And, think about the alternative. If we had a civil service in the United States where the president could hire and fire 2 or 4 million people, that's how many we have, or you in Brazil had a situation where when Bolsonaro came in, he could hire, replace the entire civil service. Well, that actually means that the stakes of government are so high, the stakes of controlling power are so high that no one would ever give up power. So a neutral civil service actually makes democracy possible. So I just want to get that definition on the table. We could talk, and I'm happy to answer questions after I'm done speaking. You might have a different definition, but I think it's a pretty good definition, and it's compatible with all kinds of systems. It could be a socialist democracy, a neoliberal economy, many, many things. Unfortunately, democracy as we define it is in big trouble. This is the Freedom House Index, and it's an indicator, a political science indicator of democracy. One of the things we see is that the number of democracies in the world and the number of people living in democracies has declined, has gone down every year from 2006. So that's bad. And interestingly, we are now at the point where the wealth, the GDP of non-democracies is greater than the GDP of democracies for the first time. And that's very significant. Obviously, the rise of China, but also the relative decline of the United States and Western Europe. So that's gravely concerning. The Economist, this is 2017, this is the first year in which most people lived in non-democracies and most countries were non-democracies. And you see they have 4 different categories: full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrid regimes, these are in between, and then authoritarian regimes. In 2017, the Economist magazine moved the United States into the category of flawed democracy. We are not a full democracy. I don't know where Brazil is, but that's obviously extremely disturbing. And so we are facing these threats even in the core countries. In the book, we identified 2 kinds of threats, agents of democratic erosion. One, and I guess the first thing to note is that the threat is of democratic erosion. It is not really very feasible that there would be a coup d'etat, a sudden end of democracy anymore. Nor do we see, communist revolutions or something like that used to happen 50 or 60 years ago. These days, the biggest threat to democracy is not a fast collapse, but a slow erosion. And we see two kinds of agents there. One is what we call the Charismatic Populist, someone like Hugo Chavez, who you see there. The man on the left is Viktor Orban, who runs Hungary, and he basically has all power in Hungary, has lots of power. And, he's running on a kind of nationalist, populist platform. But the thing about these charismatics is they claim that they have a unique ability as the leader. Donald Trump did this. I think we hear it from Bolsonaro too. It's me, and I speak for the people. And anyone who doesn't agree with me isn't part of the people. Not only that, any institution between the leader and the people is to be undermined. So we see attacks on the media, and we attacks on universities, and attacks on anything which would seem to have a representative function, because only the leader can represent the people in this mindset. So it's very dangerous. The other, though, mechanism is what we call partisan degradation. And that is where a political party is so concerned about its survival that it turns anti-democratic. The man on the right, the far right, is a governor in the United States, Scott Walker. And I think we're seeing a lot of anti-democratic talk from the Republican Party in the United States. Obviously, the incident in January 6th, where they tried to stop the counting of the ballots, was an anti-democratic act. And you might think, they would just say, well, that was just one guy, But in fact, we see many, many attacks on democratic institutions promoted by governors associated with this party. So there's kind of a war, a battle within the Republican Party, and that's very dangerous for our democracy. Now, it's not just experts who think this. This is an American public opinion survey where they ask experts and they ask the public. And the way to read this chart, it's all kinds of different elements of democracy. Is free speech allowed? Do we tolerate protests? Is there corruption? Is there a lot of participation? And anything on the right side means that most people are answering, yes, there is that element of democracy. It's very strong. Anything on the left side means that less than 50% of Americans or experts believe that we are doing well. And when you look at all of these things, you see that most Americans and most experts think we are not doing well on these various standards. And I think probably the same would be true in Brazil, if we could ask people, that people are not confident that their own country is running democracy well. Now, partly that is a fact, partly that is because in a democracy we can complain, right? I think citizens in democracies are always unhappy because we're always talking about how bad the leaders are. So that's certainly true. But when you combine that with experts who think that, no, we're really doing badly, that's very concerning. The other thing we're seeing in the United States, again from the public opinion, is support for more, I guess we would call them hardball politics, by which I mean going all the way to the extent of your power and ignoring the kind of informal norms and rules that help make constitutional democracies work. So, for example, there was a lot of discussion this year in the last election, about whether the Democrats should expand the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court has been 9 members for 150 years. They can do it. It's not mentioned in the Constitution how many members are the Supreme Court. So they could pass a law which would expand it to 15, and they could appoint 6 new justices. But that would be a kind of hardball. It's legal, it's constitutional, but it's kind of, it's not playing fair. And of course, it's dangerous because then the other side would do the same. So you see a lot of support for certain tactics now in terms of this, and it's really making our legislative process very difficult. So just when we need democracy to perform better during a pandemic, economic crisis, we're actually seeing institutions breaking down. I'll go down a little bit further. Okay, so how do these people who want to undermine constitutional democracy act? And I think the contribution of our book as constitutional lawyers is to point out that legal tools are at the center. So one thing we often see is that someone will amend the Constitution to stay in power, to get rid of a term limit, for example, or something like that, expand, let's say, the Supreme Court in some countries, to end the Constitutional Court, which is what Viktor Orban did. So you could amend the Constitution, and that sort of works well for populists. Because remember that changing the Constitution, we usually think of in democratic theory as being going back to we say in French, pouvoir constituant. I don't know if you're familiar with the expression. It means constituent power. The people themselves are speaking when they amend the Constitution. And because populists like to talk about the people, they're often manipulating the Constitution because it allows them, and Hugo Chavez was really classic here. And it actually gets to my second one, bypassing checks and balances. Normally you have a legislature, you have courts. What we see increasingly is if the legislature isn't acting as the anti-democrat wants, they just bypass it. Hugo Chavez was like this, obviously. He said, when he lost the election to the National Assembly, and actually Maduro said, that's fine, I lost that election. By the way, we're going to take all the legislative power and give it to the Constituent Assembly. The people cannot be constrained. And who are those people? Well, those are his friends who would be put in there. So that's bypassing the checks and balances, and it's a strategy we often observe. Undermining the rule of law, obviously. Ignoring court decisions or packing the courts so that the rule of law is essentially what you say it is. Attacking bureaucracy. And we see a lot of this that goes on, trying to replace civil servants or attacking them with rhetoric. Oh, they're the bureaucrats, we have to break through them. Eliminating electoral competition. This is a big one in the United States. We now have a whole bunch of laws being passed at the state level where they are trying to restrict voting. They're drawing the lines so that they will be entrenched in power, and essentially trying to make sure that they never really lose an election. And so this is something we also see. Viktor Orban in Hungary has never had more than about 47% popularity. But he always wins the elections because they have drawn the boundaries so that he will always have a majority. And maybe, and in some cases, of course, he's had a super majority. And the final legal strategy is to attack freedom of speech, attack journalists, limiting the public sphere. And there are many ways to do this. One technique is to use tax law to attack civil society organizations. So again, we've seen this in Turkey, Hungary, Venezuela. An organization that is, let's say, delivering pandemic assistance. It's helping to vaccinate people. Or an organization in Afghanistan today that is helping women. All of a sudden, that organization will wake up and it will see that the tax authorities are knocking on the door and want to see all the books. Sometimes there are laws preventing any foreign funding. And many of the civil society is kind of transnational. And so that can really restrict civil society's ability to criticize. Using libel law to attack those who have criticized the leader. We see a lot of these kind of lawsuits, and a good friend of mine, a constitutional lawyer, is now being sued in Poland because he compared the governing party He said they're a bunch of Nazis. It's something you can say. Maybe it's not a nice thing to say. Maybe it's not true. But should you, lose all your money for such a statement? Well, that's what they're doing. They're suing him to make him bankrupt. And finally, I will add universities, which play a very important role in democracy. And that's why I'm glad to be speaking to you, because I think we have to realize we in universities have a mission, especially in an era of fake news. Academic freedom becomes very, very important. We see a lot of attacks on academic freedom, including in Brazil, as you know. Conrad, whose last name I can't pronounce and won't say right now, who's now been, attacked by the government for his outspoken behavior. Well, that's a limitation on academic freedom. And academic freedom is especially important when the truth itself is under attack, as we see. We have the same in the United States. We see Republican Party attacks on certain state university employees. And we also, of course, see kind of a social pressure on many academics to be quiet. So those are sort of the tools. And their law is critical. Now, our book is about the rest of the world, but it's also about the United States. I want to make one point about the United States. This is an image from an earlier book I did, where we compare different constitutions with that of the American Constitution. So each dot there is an indication of a constitution passed since 1800. And just focusing on the left figure, that's all the constitutions adopted in Latin America. And there are many of them, because Latin America is a region with much instability, including in Brazil. Constitutions don't last a long time. And what you see is that the similarity to the US has, gone down. And, some people would say, oh, that means we're changing the Constitution too much. But there's something good about that kind of change, because it means that you can update the Constitution with new institutions, which maybe are better for dealing with the problems of today. And one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about in this book and now in my next book is about, well, how can we design a Constitution that will be better for dealing with problems of democratic erosion? Let's see. Just talking about the United States for a minute, if you go look at the American Constitution, it is very out of date. There's nothing about emergency rule. So now most of the pandemic response is being done by states under state constitutions, which have emergency provisions. But most modern constitutions, including that of Brazil, have the possibility of a crisis where a president can declare an emergency for a limited period of time and only has a certain amount of power, can't do everything. The legislature usually has a role in approving or constraining the president. And so that's a good idea, but we don't have anything like it. Madison, who was writer of our Constitution, thought that separation of powers would protect us, that institutions would fight with each other, Congress would fight against the president. But of course, he didn't really realize that modern political parties obviously can bridge those gaps. And I don't think anyone has really understood why it is that legislatures in many countries, including the United States, and I think in Brazil, are very weak now. They're not very popular. Most people don't like the legislatures. They don't like the members of parliament. And they're looking for an executive answer, a strong, powerful leader. And this is a failure of constitutional design. The US Constitution doesn't have accountability institutions. It doesn't have a counter-corruption commission. It doesn't have an auditor. Not only that, this is going to sound a little crazy for most of you, but in the United States, the Constitution says the elections will be managed by the state legislatures. The state legislatures can draw the boundaries. The state legislatures can, determine the way elections are held. And I think when they were drafting the US Constitution, they thought that the legislatures would just be like leading citizens. They didn't think of them as partisan bodies. But now, of course, legislators are partisan. They are members of political parties. And what you see is that they try to draw the boundaries and run the election for their own benefit. In fact, we have an elected official called the Secretary of State, whose job it is at the state level to run elections. And twice in the 2018 election cycle, we had those people administering elections and while they were running in the same election. So the Secretary of State, Republican Secretaries of State in Georgia and Texas were running for senator, were running for governor, and counting the ballots for their own election. That's crazy. Doesn't make any sense. But we allow it in the United States. I'll say I want to jump to impeachment because I think that's really important. In both Brazil and the United States, we have had impeachments recently. In the United States, and I'll add South Korea, I think that's another interesting case. In South Korea, when the president is impeached, as she was 4 years ago, they immediately call a new election. And that means that, it's kind of a reset in the political system. It almost turns a presidential system into a parliamentary system. In the United States, we don't have that. So Donald Trump could act, pretty crazily, but they did not want to remove him, no matter what he did, because it would mean that his vice president would take power, and the vice president was from the same party. And of course, this was somewhat of an issue in the Dilma impeachment in Brazil, where I think Temer is his name, right, if I got the name right, who came into power. And of course, he was also just as corrupt as her. So it didn't reset the system. It actually meant that now it was wide open for kind of a populist to come in. So I think impeachment rules are important, and we don't have a good system in the US. You need, I think, to make impeachment a little bit more about integrity and a little less political, but also to make sure that if you do impeach, then the other party can, that there would be a new election, you go back to the people. Okay, so those are just some things. I have a whole bunch of ideas, and I think what I'm going to do is stop sharing. Let's see if I can do this. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing, so I'm just going to talk a little. One of the things, of course, you can do, so the question is, what should we do? What can we do about this? Well, we have many ideas in constitutional design, and also what courts can do. From my point of view, courts have to play an active role in democracy protection. And that's a little tricky. What does that actually mean? It means the courts do have to some degree look at the moves where politicians try to capture the system and ask about its effect on democracy in a rigorous way. They need to make sure, in particular, that the elections machinery is neutral and, can be run in a nonpartisan way. And this is a huge problem in my country, where our Supreme Court has said we're not going to talk about how elections are run. The state legislatures, the state political parties can do whatever they want, basically, because we don't have good standards. And I think our Supreme Court is contributing to a major challenge to our democracy. One thing we have seen around the world is that courts have been good at policing anti-democratic attempts to remove term limits. So if a president is in power, they serve 2 terms and they want to keep running, well, we have many examples of courts saying, no, you can't do that. But we also have some examples, Bolivia, certainly Nicaragua, Honduras, where courts have said, no, actually, it is okay, because a term limit is a violation of the individual right of the political candidate to keep running. So that is a good example of that court decision. And those of you who follow international law will know that these courts have sometimes relied on the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights, the American Convention of Human Rights, that for support by saying because there's a right to run for office, that means someone, even if he's in office, can't be restricted. Fortunately, just last week, the Inter-American Commission said, no, we don't agree with that interpretation. But it's a little too late for Bolivia and Honduras and Nicaragua. So the point being, the court has to have a really good understanding of democracy. A court should also protect the autonomous bureaucracy and, in particular, rights to information. I think that's really important. One of the things that we see in our system is that independent electoral commissions are really, really important. And I think when one looks around the world, one sees really just how important those things are. In Turkey, which is, dominated by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the dominant leader of the AKP party, he's got control over a lot of the country. He purged the courts, he purged the prosecutors, he fired every university administrator in the country and only allowed them to come back if they applied again and they could sort of signal they would be loyal to him. He has taken over the system, but he was not able to take over the election machinery. And he lost the mayorship of Istanbul last year. That's a remarkable story, and it shows you that even in a country like Turkey, there are a lot of bureaucrats who are going to work and fulfilling their role and counting the ballots as they are supposed to. So that's something I think we have to emphasize and better understand. We also like what we call opposition rights in the legislature. A legislature that, for example, will give some role to the leader of the opposition. And the reason is that makes the opposition appear to be legitimate. The loyal opposition has a role to play in democracy. In some cases, they get to chair certain committees, they could chair the audit committee or something like that to enhance accountability. Instead, what we see in our era is to say, oh, those opposition people, they are traitors to the country. They should be eliminated. They should be destroyed. They should be sent to jail. Well, that language is not really possible if the opposition has some little role in government. So that's another thing we would like to see. We have many other suggestions, but I want to say that all of these things are only what we would call, I like to call speed bump. That's when you're driving down the road and there's a bump in the road to slow you down so you can't go too fast. An institution is a speed bump. It slows down a takeover of power. Can't prevent it completely, but at least can allow the opposition parties and civil society to organize and have some leverage against someone who's trying to take over the system. Professor Huck and I studied several cases where it looked like democracy was going to end or decline, but then at the last minute, something happened. We call them a near miss, near death experience for democracy. And it turns out that in many of those cases, Colombia, after Uribe's second re-election, or in the case involving his second re-election, Sri Lanka, Finland, we found a case, an older case. In all of those situations, it was institutions like courts, militaries, bureaucracies that saved democracy. In other words, you can't rely on political parties. You can't rely on the Republican Party to run a real democracy. You can rely on the thousands and thousands of administrators who count ballots in the United States. And it's very important to make sure that they're protected, that their institutions are protected, and that they remain robust. Now I'm a little bit beyond my time, but I want to say a little bit more about international law and what it can do about it, because I've been thinking a lot about it. We are just in a situation where Afghanistan has, was not really a strong democracy, but they did have elections, and the winner of those elections, had power. And even in the face of unspeakable violence, they kind of had a legitimate government. And that has ended. And the Taliban will not have elections, and they will not be a legitimate government. And by the way, they haven't changed at all. We were reading some things in the media about how they're the new Taliban. The only thing that changed is that they learned English. And I was telling the professors before, and I've spent some time there. I've been there 3 or 4 times. And so I think a lot about it. Afghanistan was never going to be Sweden, right? But the international cooperation was important for securing some kind of democratic space. And that's why it's very important for the United States to play an active role in engaging with international organizations, in promoting democracies around the world, and in facilitating institutions to cooperate with each other. I think one of the really important things for protecting democracy is that bureaucrats and election commissions and, courts, which play a very important role, can cooperate with each other and learn sort of democratic norms. And there are many organizations that promote this. There are many more of those organizations than those that are promoting autocracy. So strengthening all those multilateral efforts is very, very important. Of course, international law cannot turn Afghanistan into Sweden, right? Of course, international cooperation has its limits. And at the end of the day, democracy is a local thing. And democracy failed in Afghanistan for local reasons, ultimately. But just because that's true doesn't mean that international cooperation and organization cannot help a little bit at the margin, particularly when we see a big backsliding situation. So I've been thinking a lot about that and about what courts can do at the international plane. But for now, let me conclude by saying democracy is likely to survive in the United States. I think it is likely to survive in Brazil. But it is a big challenge that we are facing. And we have to learn from each other, and we have to be sure to try to understand the institutions which are so important for our ability to survive and thrive as a democracy, which is really the only way we can live together in a complex society. So let me stop there. I've talked a little bit longer than I planned, but I would be very happy to hear any questions you have or comments or corrections. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for your speech. Before I open the questions for the students, I just will ask 1 or 2 questions just to start the debate. Can you explain the gerrymandering in the USA and how affect the election in the USA? Explicitly in Wisconsin case, that was the most famous case in the USA. This is the first question. The second question, in your book, Professor Tom Ginsburg, you separate a fast road that introduce a democratic collapse and a slow one that introduce a democratic erosion. Do you think Latin America is in the second one way, or we are in Latin America is going to a more democratic system? Because here I wrote a book about judicial review in Latin America, and in this book I researched most part of these countries, and most part of them they adopt the presidential system. And the presidential system concentrates a lot of powers in the executive branch. And this is the beginning of the collapse of the democracy in these countries. So do you think parliamentary systems helps to avoid authoritarian systems and to repel the authoritarian governors and the presidential in this Latin American system? Thank you so much for your speech.
No, those are really good questions. Let me just briefly explain the gerrymandering, and then I'll talk about presidentialism, parliamentarism, and the prospects. So gerrymandering, it's a word that comes from the name of a guy named Jerry, and an animal called a salamander. I don't know how you say it in Portuguese, but it's a
yes,
long
salamandra in Portuguese.
Oh, okay. So we take the last part of that, because what happened is they would draw the election district in the way that would mean they would be sure to win, but it looked like a salamander. It looked so crazy. And I sometimes say in the United States, we don't have a system where the voters pick the politicians. We have a system where the politicians pick their voters because they can draw the districts. Wisconsin was won by Joe Biden. In the previous election was very closely won by Donald Trump, but basically 50-50, the population. But the state legislature is 2/3 Republican because they have drawn the boundaries. So how do you get from a 50-50 population to 2/3 of one party? You draw the districts in a way to maximize your side. So that's a grave threat. Unfortunately, we do know how to fix it. It is to have the boundaries be drawn by a neutral commission. 18 states have chosen to take the power from the legislature and give it to a neutral commission of technocrats. And those states have much more competitive elections, much more responsive to changes in the population and such. So we know how to fix it, but we can't force states to do it in our constitutional system. They have to voluntarily do it. And so it's a big American problem. And actually, in terms you ask about the prospects, I think where the United States is going, I don't think democracy is going to end in the United States. I don't think that's possible. But I do think we will have some states where democracy has basically ended, where the majority cannot vote out a minority which controls the political machinery. And we had that for 100 years after the end of slavery in the southern part of the country. Those weren't democratic states. They had elections, but the black people couldn't vote. So it wasn't really democratic. And I think we're kind of heading towards that in some of those southern states. Now, your bigger question, what should we do about constitutional design? There's a big literature on presidentialism and parliamentarism. Actually, the best scholar in the world is Brazilian, José Antonio Chebub, who's in Texas now. He wrote a wonderful book about this. Scholars always say, well, presidentialism has too much concentrated power. That's true. But when we think about backsliding, we see that it has occurred in presidential systems, in what we call semi-presidential systems, the French model where you have a president and a prime minister, which was what Turkey was. Venezuela's presidential, Turkey was semi-presidential, Poland is semi-presidential, but Hungary is parliamentary. So even in a parliamentary system, you can have a charismatic leader come. Now I'm writing a paper now. This is kind of a secret thing. No one steal my idea or no one go tell everybody. But my secret paper, which I'm drafting, actually says the one kind of system where we don't see this kind of populism is constitutional monarchy. Like if in England, you have Queen Elizabeth. So that means, Boris Johnson can't say, I'm the only one who represents the people, right? He has a limited ability to rise. And statistically, we do see that countries which are monarchies, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, they have some populists, but they never take over. The populists never take over. So it's kind of an interesting result. But of course, I'm not suggesting that Brazil should go back to constitutional monarchy. I don't think that's going to be a popular position. Now, to me, the region is very strongly presidential, and it's very hard to change. There's a lot of just keeping what we know. But there are some things one could do. You could change the legislative system. Right now, Brazil is very famous for having extremely weak parties, right? And that's because of this strange voting system you have, like pretty bizarre. I remember learning about it when I visited, and I couldn't understand why they would adopt it. But it's basically designed to have a very strong man with not a strong parliament. So you could change that. You could move towards a plurality district system or something like that. And that would improve things. So I guess I feel like you don't need to get rid of presidentialism, but you need to have better systems of control. I think Chile is going to be extremely interesting to watch. In Chile, we see a kind of, popular and populist demand for new social arrangements. And I'm very optimistic that Chile is going to draft a constitution, although they don't have very much time. They gave themselves like 1 year to write a constitution. That's not very long. But I think they'll be able to do it because of the way things have come up. And I think it's going to be kind of a new model, a little more social democratic. And you might like that, you might not. I don't take an opinion on whether it's a better form of government. But I think that if they do that, it will perhaps have some implications for other countries in the region, for Argentina, for Brazil, for Peru, which is thinking about the same thing, which is kind of to steer a middle path, not some crazy Bolivarian revolution, which never worked, but trying to reform institutions in a kind of orderly way, in a way that makes them more legitimate. So that's my hope for Latin America. We'll see.
Thank you so much. Melanie, I don't know if someone wants to make some questions, or Professor Romulo and the other.
Professor Romulo is muted. I don't think we can hear it.
Can I make a question?
Yes.
We have a problem in Brazil that since 1895, or 126 years ago, we have no refuse in any indication to the Brazilian Supreme Court. There are cases when the president indicated a cousin of him, Judge Marco Aurelio de Mello. You have judges that are excessively polemic, and in short, the president can indicate whatever he wants. And I find this particularly dangerous when there is no control in history. What do you think about this when we have single majority, most of the total members of the Congress, of the Senate in reality, but a single majority is not a qualified majority to indicate a member?
So let me make sure I understood. I might have missed the first part of your question. Simple majority to approve of justice of the court? Is that what you heard?
Yeah, we have 81 senators in our Senate. And so the indication of the president is approved if he achieves 41, which more than half of the members. And every president have achieved that since 1895. So they have indicated whatever they want. And so they have relative control in the Supreme Court. We will not have now because of the change in the party, but if we have the same party in the presidency for a long time, we will have a co-opted Supreme Court.
Yeah, obviously it's critical. The question is whether a qualified majority would be better. Simple majority seems to me very low. I would think at a minimum you'd want absolute majority of the members, because otherwise, like if some of the members don't come, you could have, 30% approving the president's guy, so that seems very difficult. We are now having a major conversation about Supreme Court appointments. There is a commission that Biden has set up to study the issue, and I was actually testifying before them a couple weeks ago. New ideas for what we should do about our court. And we want to do it in a way that isn't going to be too partisan, but will fix some of the problems. We have a very high threshold, 2/3, and that's usually, excuse me, I got that wrong. We have a 50% threshold to put someone on the court, but it's become such a political battle now that is just absolutely politicizing the members of the court. My opinion is that partly that is it's not because of the court itself and what it's doing. It's because the parties are looking to fight about something, and they promise their supporters, if you just elect us, we'll get a justice on the court that will stop abortion or that will defend abortion or something. They really are politicizing from outside, and that's not good for the court. My solution would be to lower the stakes of the court by actually having the terms much shorter in my country. Right now, we have the terms are for life. Yeah, but at least they retire at a young age. I mean, they retire at a retirement age, right?
Yeah, 75.
75. So that means they're powerful, but they're not going to be there till they die. Whereas in my country, I was saying this actually, it's, the Pope, the Queen of England, and the justices of the Supreme Court. They're the only ones who will die in their office, and it's crazy. So I think we could have a retirement age like you have.
They call tenure for this function.
That's true, but I hope to retire before I die. I'd like to have a few years smelling the coffee, as we say. But yes, someone pointed out, well, yes, academics also have this privilege. But anyway, look, I don't know. I think the goal is to make the appointments to the court not political. And there are lots of ways you could do that. Maybe shorter terms, maybe reduction in the power of the court, maybe raising the majority, as you suggest. But the goal should be to depoliticize law as much as possible. Expanding the court like the Germans have, the Supreme Court there, that would be a way to do it. So.
Thank you very much.
We have more questions from the audience. I don't know if Melanie can open the questions for the audience.
Yes, Professor Heberbel. We got one question for our colleague George based on the Professor Ginsburg publication, The Jurisprudence of Anti-Erosion, in 2018. Enrique, please, can you introduce the question?
Sure. You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Professor, we were reading your article, The Jurisprudence of Anti-Erosion, in our study group. So, our classmate, George, has a question for you. Well, it's about the role of the courts in keeping the democracy and saving it. The Brazilian Constitutional Court, the Supreme Federal Court, provides that each minister can individually execute individual decisions even before submitting them to the bench, to the full bench evaluation. According to Article 21 of the internal regulation of the court. Understanding that this singular decision may be able to interfere in the attributions of several parliamentaries acting collectively in their typical parliamentary functions. As a mere reflection, would this power, from your point of view, considering a comparative constitutional law approach, would this decision have more potential to create an anti-erosion decision or act in the opposite way, contributing to the erosion? I don't know if you got the...
So if I understand the question, you're saying, you have a system where individual justice, on the court can immediately issue a decision without checking with their colleagues, basically.
Yeah.
That strikes me as very dangerous and strange because it will introduce a kind of strategic game of however the cases are assigned to the justices, and maybe that's the Chief Justice will have that power, but it could give him some ability to influence outcomes by sending things to particular people, especially if they're really divided on substantive issues. The law is complicated, as we all know. And we like to think that for policy-making courts, for important decisions, there should be deliberation in the court about the law. This isn't just about, votes, aggregating votes. It's about deliberating and coming to the best reasoned answer. And having one person just decide doesn't strike me as good. In fact, that's one of the big problems with the U.S. Supreme Court. So many of our decisions, heck, climate change and around the world, and from my point of view, it's much worse than it should be because of one decision in 2000 to give the presidency to Bush versus Gore. Gore was interested in climate change, but one justice basically made that decision because he was a Republican. And the rest of, history was changed because of it. So you want deliberation. So my instinct is that that's probably not the best solution, but I would like to learn more about it.
I don't know if we have more questions from the audience, Henrique.
We have lots of questions here, Professor.
Let's do it.
I guess we'll make one or two more. And so one of our master's classmate, Graziella, who studied freedom of speech, freedom of expression, she has a question on that. So the United States has a very peculiar view on freedom of expression, to the point of considering it an almost absolute right. In your opinion, what are the perspectives from this right in the next few years? Can there be a relativization when it comes to hate speech, for example?
Things which other societies would choose to limit. And interestingly, I think our culture, the young people, the students that I teach, often have the impulse that we have too much speech. We don't want to have hate speech around. So they are kind of making social restrictions. If a professor says the wrong word in class, there will be protests against that professor. And, that's fine. I'm not criticizing that. But there's an impulse to quiet down the other side. In our book, we recognize that hate speech causes harms, and we're not in favor of it, obviously, but it always raises the question, who decides? Who decides? And for the risk of democratic erosion, the risk is that hate speech regulations become weaponized. My friend I mentioned before, the Polish scholar Wojciech Sidursky, who's written a wonderful book about Poland's constitutional breakdown, criticized the ruling party. They sued him for libel. That's a restriction on his speech. They're saying, you lied about us, we're going to take every cent you ever had. Well, that's because they're the government and they can decide. And I think the same can be true about hate speech. Sometimes the restrictions go too far. And no one likes to hear hate speech, but it's best if it's regulated by the society rather than the government. And that's where I really still, I guess, favor the American approach. I'm American, I can't get my head around it. In our book, we point out an example where Bob Dylan, the singer, was prosecuted for hate speech because he said something like, boy, the Croats think the Serbs are a bunch of Nazis and the Serbians think the Croats are a bunch of Nazis, and something like that. He's, hate speech, you've insulted our people. Well, I don't know. I think I'd like to hear a better account of how we would actually get good regulation thereof.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Henrique, if you can read one more question, if Professor...
Yeah, I have time.
Could.
Yeah, so we have one question from Alexandre Pedro, also master in constitutional law by our university. Professor Ginsburg, Alexander, question did you think that the federative design of state or more political decentralization has an important role to prevent a democratic erosion?
Can you read it again? I just couldn't hear.
Did you think that the federative design or the state or more political decentralization has an important role to prevent a democratic erosion?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think about it a lot. Yeah, federalism, I think, probably is good for preventing democratic erosion. Because if you're someone who wants to take over the whole system, it's harder, right? But I think it does lead to what I mentioned before as my prediction for the United States, which is we're going to become only a partly democratic country, territorially. We'll have some democratic states and some non-democratic states. But maybe that's better than having a unitary government where if the bad actor manages to take over, then they have all power. Federalism is an important limit on the government power and a constraint on abuse of emergency power, I think, in many, many countries. And actually, you've seen it in Brazil with the COVID, where as I understand, it was some courts at the state level, provincial level, which said, you know, wait a minute, you have to have a lockdown. You know, you can't just let people die in the streets. I mean, there was a conversation between the government and the regional governors and the local courts, and that's how it should be, I think, to get better policy.
Because we have a very centralized federalism in Brazil. Most part of the competences are located in the union power. And we call Brazil is a federalism, but the rules is in another way. I don't know, Henrique, if we have another question?
Yeah, but I want to say one more thing about the federalism. All over the world, people know Porto Alegre. Everyone knows Porto Alegre in this, people who study government, because of the experiment you had with the budget process, the participatory budgeting that you invented. Well, you couldn't do that in a unitary state. You can't do that in China, you know? So even if it's not true or very strong federalism, you still have the ability to innovate at the local level. And so I do think it is, you know, better than a true unitary state.
No doubt, no doubt. One more question, Henrique?
Yeah, I can make one from Thais, one of our classmates as well. So, Professor, how do you differentiate, what's the difference between a populist instance of political power from a political decision of the people? And also, where does you draw the line to identify a democratic erosion as being promoted from a government which is acting within the law?
Okay, such good questions, you guys. These are great questions. So first, I want to be clear. I'm sometimes criticizing populism, but I don't want to criticize populism. Populism is important, and we see it in every society. When the elites get out of touch, you need populism. But I think it's important to distinguish between populist politics, running as a populist, and governing as a populist. We see many times, like Barack Obama was kind of a populist, right? We had a party in the 19th century called the People's Party, and they were demanding, you know, returning power to the people. It's really important. So that's where that's where populism is sometimes used as a kind of insult or epithet, but it has a big role to play. What I'm concerned with is what I've called charismatic populism, which is governing as a populist. And those kind of governors, Orban, Chavez, etc., they are very bad for democracy because they try to erode all of those institutions which make democracy work. So I've never seen someone govern as a populist that was good, but running as a populist is important. I want to make that distinction. So, you know, that's why popular and populism can go together. I forgot the second question.
The second question is about how you will draw a line to identify a democratic erosion as being promoted from a government when it's acting within the law.
Yeah, good. And here I think my last answer summarized it. Institutions. Is your government attacking the neutral institutions which are necessary for democracy to work? the courts, the bureaucracy, the military, the election institutions, the auditors. If you're attacking them, then you are trying to erode democracy from within. If you think about what is democracy, it's two or more parties fighting very intensively. But then when they lose, they admit defeat and wait till the next election. And that fighting has to be structured within a set of rules. As long as everyone accepts the rules, democracy can go on forever. But when someone starts trying to attack those rules themselves, especially these fundamental core ones, then they are trying to erode from within. And that is the biggest threat of our time. But I'm actually, believe it or not, I'm still optimistic, because even though we have all these, dictatorships which are gaining strength, Iran and China and such, boy, we still have a lot of successes that no one's paying much attention to. Indonesia, Armenia had a democratic movement. A small African country called Malawi last year, where the president wanted to stop the election during COVID, and the court said no, and now that president's out of power. So I think the world kind of moves in cycles, and we had a big democratic wave in the 90s, and now, it's heading down, but it's not going to head down all the way, and there will always be a space for some democratic systems, and hopefully those will continue to be the richest and most successful societies.
I don't know if we have more questions or if the professor have time to answer one or more, or we can
time.
So the last one, maybe, Henrique, the last one question.
Yeah, sure. Can I make a question myself?
Please.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Professor, what's your view about the Electoral College in the U.S.? Do you think it contributes to democracy and
It's a good question. So for those who don't know, we have this crazy system where you have to win not, the national election, but you have to win the majority of these votes, which are weighted very heavily to the rural area. And it's not a system they would have designed. They didn't design it. It was a compromise that they came up with in 1 hour, during a meeting in 1787, and yet it still determines the way we run our elections. It's not great. It's not great. I will say there's one good thing about it, which means that to win an election, you have to compete in different regions of the country. You could imagine in Brazil, if you had a system, a pure majority or something like that, then I know you have a 2-round system, but you might imagine that one party could just have Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, and they would run everything, or 3 or 4 cities in the center of the country. And in the United States, that would be Washington, D.C., and New York, and Boston. That's where a lot of people are and a lot of power and all the money. So the Electoral College forces you to compete all over, and you never know which state is going to be important. Some years it's Arizona, some years it's Florida. You never know. So that's the one possible virtue. But we would never design it this way. Far better, from my point of view, is a 2-round system where you have to win a true national majority. And there's now a movement, very interesting, of the states where they are kind of talking about making a promise to each other that they will give their electoral votes to whoever wins the national majority, even if that person doesn't win their state. And if we have enough states that agree to that, that would mean we could get around this. So we're trying to work on kind of a bypass to that system. I could imagine the U.S. Supreme Court saying it's not constitutional, but I don't see why not.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much to give us this conference and answer the questions. Thank you, Romulo, Melanie, Henrique, and our group that helps us in this conference, because we make one per month, more or less. And we study authors and books and professors in all the world, and we send message and invite to give us speeches. So I would like to thank you, and we are reading a lot of your texts, your books. We agree with your ideas, like we quote the same books like Schumpeter, Lon Fuller, and other books that you research, and we research here too in south of Brazil. And thank you so much for this moment. And I think we can finish here. I don't know if you want to say something before we cancel the transmission.
Yeah, I will just say thank you very much. Excellent questions. So obviously you're teaching the students very well down there. And I look forward to visiting in person one day. Yes. Everyone should stay very safe.
Okay, so just a minute before cancel, Melanie, can you cancel the transmission and we stay with the professor 2 more minutes just to say goodbye and thank you personally?
Yes, of course.